Okay, so get this. The Department of Justice is thinking about forcing Google to sell off Chrome.
Wow.
Yeah, Chrome. We're going to do a deep dive into the DOJ's antitrust case against Google, and especially this whole thing with Chrome.
Yeah.
And we'll see why some people think it's the answer to a more fair internet, and other people think it's like cutting off Google's left foot.
Yeah, it's interesting how Chrome is the central point in the case. The DOJ is saying that it's the key to how Google is dominating search, but Google's saying no, it's all about what users want.
So can we break this down? What's the DOJ's argument here? Why are they so focused on Chrome?
Well, they're saying that because Chrome is already on Android phones and because of those deals Google makes to be the default search engine,
Right.
that it unfairly funnels users into using their search engine, and that just makes them even more dominant in the market and gives them more data on people.
So they're saying that Google is using Chrome to trap people in their world and make it impossible for other search engines to compete.
Exactly. And they point to how much of the market Chrome has, 2/3 of everyone around the world uses it.
Wow.
And then there's that ruling from back in August 2024 where a judge actually said that Google was doing illegal stuff to keep its monopoly in search.
Yeah, that was a big one. And what about all those emails and stuff that came out during the trial? Were those bad for Google?
Oh, yeah. They didn't look good.
Yeah.
But the DOJ is using those documents where Google people talked about crushing their competitors as proof that Google wasn't just accidentally being dominant. They were trying to stop anyone else from getting big.
Yikes. So what does Google say about all this? I mean, they can't just give up.
Of course not. They're fighting back hard. They're saying that Chrome is popular because it's good and because it works so well with all their other stuff.
Right.
They say people choose to use Google and that if the government messes with things, it'll slow down new ideas and make things harder for users.
I can see their point. But how do they explain all that money they pay to be the default search on so many devices and browsers? That doesn't sound like a free market.
Well, they're saying it's about giving everyone a good experience no matter what device they're using.
Okay, but is that all there is to it? It seems like there's more going on here.
Yeah, you're right. It's about how much power these big tech companies should have and how we make sure everyone has a fair chance in the online world. And if the DOJ wins and Google has to sell Chrome, things could get really interesting.
Interesting in a good way or a bad way?
Well, that's what we're going to talk about. We need to look at what could happen if Google loses Chrome.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? What kind of impact could this have?
So the DOJ thinks that if Chrome is sold, it'll give other search engines a real chance to grow and compete.
Okay.
And maybe we'll get some cool new ideas and better options for users. Plus, it could limit how much data Google can collect through Chrome.
So it's like hitting the reset button on the whole search engine world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, Google is saying that things will be terrible if they have to split up with Chrome. They're saying it'll mess up the experience for users and make things less secure and slow down innovation.
So we've got the DOJ saying this is the answer, and Google saying it's a disaster. Who's right?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because there are a lot of experts who have different opinions about what might happen if Google has to sell Chrome.
Okay, so let's hear from the experts and see what they had to say about all this.
Yeah, let's do it. It's going to be a wild ride.
Okay, so we've got this big fight between the DOJ and Google about Chrome. But before we get to what the experts are saying, I'm wondering, how is the DOJ actually planning to make things more fair if Google does have to sell Chrome?
That's a good question. And to be honest, the details are kind of vague right now, but the DOJ's plan is mostly about stopping Google from using those default search deals to give themselves an advantage.
Okay.
They're talking about making Google include choice screens on new devices and browsers, so when you set things up, you could pick your search engine from a list instead of just automatically getting Google.
So it would be like a real menu with options, not just Google.
Exactly. They're saying this would give other search engines a chance to win people over with better features instead of just losing because they're not the default.
That makes sense. I bet Google isn't happy about that.
Nope. They're saying that those choice screens would actually be bad for users because it'd make things more complicated and maybe people would end up with bad search engines.
So Google's saying they're just looking out for us and that it's better if they're the default.
Right. But let's go back to Chrome for a second. The DOJ is also worried that Chrome itself, not just the default deals, is stopping new ideas from happening. How does that work?
Yeah, How did that work?
So they're saying because Chrome is so connected to Google's other stuff and because so many people use it, Google has an unfair advantage in a few ways.
Hmm.
Like, they say that Google makes sure its own services show up first in Chrome, which makes it harder for other companies to compete.
Oh, so it's like when you go to the supermarket and they put certain brands right at eye level so you'll see them first?
Yeah, exactly. But instead of a shelf, it's happening inside the Chrome browser. And the DOJ is also saying that Google uses its control over Chrome to get tons of data about what people are doing online.
Oh.
And they use that data to sell better ads to companies, which just makes them even more powerful.
I see how that's a problem for Google's competitors.
Yeah.
But Google says they're just better, and that's why they're so successful. What proof does the DOJ have that Google is actually stopping competition on purpose?
Well, besides those emails we talked about where Google people talked about staying on top, the DOJ points to some specific things that Google has done.
Like what?
Like, there have been times when Google has made it hard for other companies to use certain tools or information that could have helped them compete with Google, or they've made it hard for other browsers to work well on Android phones.
So it's not just about Chrome itself?
Hmm.
It's about how Google might be using Chrome to make things hard for its competitors in all sorts of ways.
Right. And that's why this whole thing is so important. It's not just about search engines and browsers. It's about how powerful these big tech companies are and how we can make sure there's a level playing field in the digital world.
It makes you wonder if Chrome was a totally separate thing, not connected to Google at all. Would the internet be completely different today?
That's a really interesting question. It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely something to think about. You mentioned earlier that Google's saying really bad things would happen if they had to sell Chrome. What are they so scared of?
Well, they're really worried about what it would mean for how people use the internet. They say that without Chrome being part of Google, everything will become a mess and it will be a pain to use. They're worried about things like syncing your information across devices, remembering your passwords, and keeping your information safe online. All that stuff would be harder if Google wasn't in charge of Chrome.
Do you think they're being honest, or are they just trying to scare people?
I think there's some truth to what they're saying. Chrome is definitely a big part of how Google does things, and a lot of people depend on those features. But some people say Google's exaggerating how bad things would be to protect themselves.
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
And that's why we need to hear from experts who can give us their honest opinions about what might happen if Google has to sell Chrome.
Right. Let's hear what the experts have to say. They're economists, legal people, and tech people, all with different ideas about this whole thing.
Yeah, and their opinions are all over the place. Some of them think this would be great for competition and lead to new ideas, while others are much more cautious and worried about what could go wrong.
Okay, so let's hear what these experts have to say. We've got a lot to talk about, like what could be good about this, what could be bad, and what might happen that no one's even thinking about.
Yeah, and it's interesting how different people see the good and bad stuff. One economist we should definitely talk about is John Quokka. He's been saying for a while that we need to break up these big tech companies, and he thinks selling off Chrome is a great chance to make the market more competitive.
So he's on board with this whole thing.
Totally. Quokka says that if Google has to sell Chrome, it'll finally stop them from having all that data about everyone, which is how they've stayed so powerful. He thinks that if everyone had a fair chance, we'd see a ton of new ideas for search engines because companies would have to work harder to make better, more private options.
So for Quokka, it's not just about giving other search engines a chance. It's about changing the whole way search engines work.
Yeah. He thinks that forcing Google and Chrome to be separate would make everyone compete more fairly, and that would make the whole internet better and more exciting.
That sounds good. But I'm guessing not everyone is so excited about this.
You're right. There are definitely some people who are worried, like Tafian Perry from Equative. He agrees that losing Chrome would hurt Google, but he doesn't think it would destroy them. Okay. He says Google has so many other products and services like Android, YouTube, Gmail, Google Maps, all that stuff, that they'd still be a major player even without Chrome.
So it's like they'd lose an arm, but they wouldn't die.
Exactly. Perry thinks Google is smart enough and has enough resources to find other ways to get people to use their stuff and collect data, even if they don't have Chrome. He thinks they might put even more effort into Android because almost everyone has an Android phone, or they might focus more on advertising because their ads are everywhere.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Quokka thinks this would change everything, and Perry thinks Google would find a way to survive.
Right. And then there are people like Rebecca Haw-Allensworth, who's a legal expert. She's not really looking at the market stuff, but she's thinking about what the law says and if this would even work in the long term.
What does she think?
She's not so sure that forcing Google to sell Chrome would actually hold up in court. She talks about old cases like when they tried to break up Microsoft back in the 2000s, and those decisions were later reversed or changed. She says it's hard to prove that Google is actually doing something illegal to stop competition, and even if the DOJ wins now, it might not last forever.
So even if Google has to sell Chrome, it might not be the end of the story.
Yeah, and she's also worried about things that might happen that no one's expecting. Like maybe forcing this breakup would stop people from coming up with new ideas for browsers, or maybe it would make things really confusing for people to use the internet if different browsers don't work well together.
It seems like there's a lot of uncertainty about what might happen if Chrome gets separated from Google.
There is. And that's what makes this whole thing so interesting. It's making us think about really big questions like, what's the government's role in all this? How much power should these tech companies have? And what's the future of the internet going to look like?
And it reminds us that we need to be careful and think about all the different sides of this before we decide what should happen.
Definitely. There are no easy answers here. But by listening to everyone and thinking about the risks and the benefits, we can start to really understand this complicated issue.
And hopefully make better decisions about what we want the internet to be. So what should we be thinking about as this case goes forward? What are the most important things to remember?
Well, first of all, this whole thing shows us just how much power a few big tech companies have over our online lives. Whether Google wins or loses this fight, it's clear that we need to figure out how to make sure everyone has a fair shot and stop companies from becoming monopolies.
Yeah, this is about way more than just Chrome. It's about how we control big tech and protect people in this digital world.
Exactly. And another thing to remember is that whenever we make a big change in the tech world, there can be unexpected consequences. The DOJ wants to make things more competitive and protect our privacy, which are good things, but we also need to think about what could go wrong, like if the internet gets split up into a bunch of pieces or if it starts to work worse for people.
It's a tough balance.
It is. And finally, this whole case reminds us that we as people who use the internet have a responsibility to shape its future. We need to pay attention, join the conversation, and let our voices be heard as the people in charge are trying to figure out what to do.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel like we can't do anything, but the more we know about how these things work and what the choices mean, the better we can fight for the kind of internet we want.
I agree. And who knows, maybe this whole thing will lead to a bunch of new ideas and we'll end up with an internet that's more diverse, more competitive, and more focused on what people actually want.
I like the sound of that. Thanks for explaining all this. It's been a really interesting deep dive.
Happy to do it. It's always fun to talk about these complicated things with you.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Google antitrust case. We'll keep following this story and let you know what happens. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.